Hello there. Welcome to my review of the Rockford Files Season 1, Episode 10, The Dexter Crisis. Written by Gloriette Clark and directed by Alexander Grashoff. The episode begins with two women entering their apartment. One is convinced someone is spying on them and gets the other to take down the license plate of the car outside their building. We then cut to Rockford in an office block, making a nuisance of himself for Charles Dexter, played by Tim O'Connor.
Don't use that. That's a low-stuff plate.
Our first Columbo connection, as he played sleazy lawyer and temporary patsy Michael Hathaway in Double Shock.
So you really couldn't have killed anybody from that attorney's banquet?
Well, it's always flattering to be considered.
Of course, you could have had him killed.
And murder victim Edward Litton in Old Fashioned Murder. Either side of his appearance here. There's an almost Clouseau-esque scene between them and Dexter's poor secretary over Rockford's smoking habit, before Dexter begins to go into detail over why he's hiring Rockford. Susan Parsons has disappeared and Dexter doesn't believe she's simply run away, but is very cagey about his relationship with her.
I think you can assume the nature of our relationship.
Which irritates Jim.
You have a very irritating manner. So do you.
Dexter eventually explains he is having an affair with Susan, and then tries and fails to negotiate a cheaper fee with Jim.
$200 a day plus expenses.
That's absurd. I'll give you 50 and no expenses.
Mr. Dexter, I don't know what you think is going on here, but I sell a service.
Dexter also reveals that Susan shares a flat with her roommate, and it doesn't take Rockford's detective skills to work out she is one of the women we saw in the prologue. He goes to see the roommate, the other woman, Louise, the one who spotted the spy, and she briefly thinks he's a cop. She wants to work with Rockford in exchange for the information she has, which, after dealing with Sandra Turkle a few episodes ago, it's easy to see why he's against this.
And you let me help you look for Susan. In-person help, I mean, teamwork.
Oh, no, I'm sorry.
He eventually gives in, and with her plate spotting, is able to identify the spy as Kermit Higbee, a rival PI with a bitter grudge against Jim, meaning Louise is going to have to be the one to question him. It seems that Higbee and his secretary have a sideline in the escort business. This is a brilliantly simple way of setting up the differences between Higbee's seedy operation and Jim's, and why there might be animosity between them. It also helps further establish the slightly lighter tone to this episode.
If you don't feel you got your money's worth, there really is nothing I can do about it. Of course, sir.
It appears that Louise is almost as good at running a con as Jim, and she finds out where Higbee is.
I'm not going to tell you what I found out. At least not yet. I'll give you directions. I gotta pack a few things, then get on the San Bernardino freeway.
Las Vegas, huh?
This all takes us back to Las Vegas, where Louise spots Susan at a roulette table.
That's Susan.
Where?
This may all seem a little convenient, but according to her conversation with Jim, they've been checking all the casinos for Higbee, so it's at least believable that eventually they would come across the one that Susan's been staying at the whole time. Jim sends Louise back to their motel and checks in with Dexter before he approaches Susan, using all his roulette skills to schmooze her, all while being watched by Kermit Higbee. In a similar scenario to the previous episode, it looks like Susan is genuinely falling for the fake Rockford persona. It seems like everyone loves a gambler.
I had a wonderful time tonight. I've been sort of lonely here until tonight.
He goes back to his motel and fills Louise in, telling her she might as well go home as Susan is safe. But Louise wants to help protect Susan, leading Jim to question her motives.
You can't protect Susan from herself, because that's not called protection.
What's it called?
Meddling.
They do a really good job of establishing the relationship between this pair very quickly. She is naive, but also smart, and he is much more world-weary and smarter, so his advice never feels patronising, even if she takes it that way. Louise goes back to her room, but when Jim goes to apologise, she's gone. He checks the casino where Susan has returned, but with no sign of Louise. So he checks Susan's room. There he finds Louise knocked out before he's clocked by none other than Dexter, searching for something. When they both come to, Jim tells her to leave again, and when she doesn't, he gets a security guard to scare her off, before instigating a chance encounter with Susan so he can be there when she discovers her room has been turned over. He agrees to drive her to Reno and pick up her suitcase from the airport.
The airline misplaced my other suitcase when I flew out here, but they found it. Can we stop and pick it up on the way out of town?
Yeah.
On their way out of town, Jim spots a tail, the ubiquitous Kermit Higbie, and following him is Louise. Jim manages to outwit Higbie, but is still none the wiser as to what's going on. In Reno, he visits Susan in her room and tells her who he really is. She eventually comes clean, but he can't quite believe how clean, until Louise turns up with a cop and gets Rockford arrested.
If you don't take us all in together, you'll never see them again.
Hey, why don't you let me worry about that, Buster?
Unfortunately, the cop is none too bright, and the girls flee quite easily, which proves Rockford right.
There's a guy outside, says his name is Albert Frost. Claims Rockford here was working for him.
Albert Frost, huh? It's a little risky using phony names with the cops, isn't it?
And tells Dexter to come clean about why he was really hired.
What's Susan got that you and everybody else is chasing after?
Susan stole $250,000 from Dexter, and he wants it back. Jim is none too happy about being lied to by pretty much everybody, but stays on the case, resorting to sitting at the side of the road out of Reno, hoping to spot Susan and Louise. Which, after a long wait, he does. And they are once again being tailed by Higbie. Eventually, noticing their pursuer, they skid off the road and crash, and Higbie takes off, leaving Jim to be the one to save them. They still refuse to give up the location of the money, but he's too good a guy to leave them in the desert. Unfortunately, Higbie puts a spanner in the works, and Jim takes action, much to his regret.
There's a reason I didn't do that before. I think I broke my hand.
Back at Dexter's, we find out that the girls have to return the money, and Jim gets stiffed on his reward, but at least gets paid. Also discovering that Higbie was hired by Mrs. Dexter to prove her husband was having an affair, which of course he was. This is a quirky little episode where it feels like a bit of a retread of the big rip-off with just a few slight changes. Everything seems to happen at a lightning pace, while nothing really happens. Susan's efforts to make a run for it are pretty pathetic, quickly being found by Higbie, then Jim and Louise. Apparently only staying in Nevada so she can launder the money through the gambling scheme, although it's never really made clear why she's laundering the money at all, since she seems convinced Dexter will not pursue her through legal means. And it looks like she's right. Louise turning Jim into the cops so she and Susan can make off with the money is also not really set up particularly well, and there's a lot of filler with some of the driving scenes in order to justify Jim's plan to sit and wait at the side of the road. It feels like it still needed a few of the kinks worked out of the script to tighten things up, but even so, I still enjoyed it, thanks to the humour and the performances, so I can't be too harsh on it. For me, this is a 3 out of 5. Thank you. Goodbye.